My name is Caleb Jones. I'm 70 years old, and I built my life with my own two hands. Last night, my son told me I was worthless while sitting in the $2.4 million house I built for him. I just looked at him, nodded, and said, I understand. He thought he had won. What he didn't know was that by sunrise, the house would no longer belong to me. Before I tell you how a single phone call unraveled his entire world, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. And please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned, not inherited. The house on Willow Creek always has a special kind of quiet after the sun goes down. It isn't a peaceful quiet. It's cold, heavy, like the air in a room where no one has laughed for a long time. That evening, the silence was thicker than Austin fog in the winter. I sat at the head of the dining table, an oak table I had planed and assembled myself more than 30 years ago. Its surface still held the faint scars of happy family meals, the echo of my wife Martha's laughter, and the memory of Donovan spilling his milk as a child. Now it was just a vast empty space separating me from my son and his wife. Heather, my daughter-in-law, swirled the expensive Chardonnay in her glass. The light from the crystal chandelier overhead danced on her diamond ring, a cold and lifeless sparkle. Donovan, darling, she began, her voice artificially sweet. I was just thinking, this space has so much potential, but it feels a bit dated, old-fashioned, Donovan. My son immediately put his fork down like a soldier awaiting an order. What do you mean, honey? I think it looks fine. He said it, but his eyes darted toward me, a look that was almost an apology, but too cowardly to ever become one. Oh no. Oh, I mean, it's very sturdy. Heather continued, emphasizing the word sturdy as if she were describing an ancient relic, not a home. But just imagine if we knocked out this wall between the dining room and the living room, replace these old wood floors with Italian marble. It would create such a modern open concept space, perfect for your company parties. I felt a tightening in my chest, these old wood floors. I had spent an entire summer selecting each pine plank, cutting, sanding, and laying them myself. Martha had been by my side, bringing me iced tea and laughing when I complained about my aching back. Each one of those planks held a piece of our memory. I remained silent, continuing to cut the steak on my plate. Silence has always been my best weapon. It forces others to fill the void, and in doing so, they often reveal their true selves. Donovan cleared his throat. That's a big idea, Heather. It would cost a fortune. It's an investment, my love, she replied, taking a sip of wine. A $2.4 million house in Austin can't look like a log cabin. We need to upgrade it to match your status now. Besides, she glanced at me, a thin smile on her lips. We also need to optimize the living space. Perhaps a home gym in the basement would be more practical than a dusty old wood shop. That's when the knife in my hand stopped moving. The wood shop. The place where I first taught Donovan how to hold a hammer, where I made him his first wooden car. The place I retreated to after Martha died, letting the smell of sawdust and unfinished projects keep me from going mad. Donovan saw me freeze. The discomfort was plain on his face. He turned to me, forcing a placating smile. Dad, what do you think? It's just an idea. I didn't look at him. I looked at Heather. I saw the victory in her eyes. She was testing me. She wanted a reaction. My silence seemed to irritate Donovan more than a curse would have. My silence was a mirror, and he didn't like the reflection of the man he saw in it, a weakling led by his wife, disrespectful to his father. And then he said it. His voice rose, filled with a pent-up frustration. Dad, Heather and I are busting our asses off to maintain this lifestyle. You just sit here, eat our food, and don't help with anything. You're becoming worthless. Worthless. The word hung in the air, sharp as a shard of broken glass. It severed the last thread connecting the past to the present. I, Caleb Jones, who had built this very house with these two hands, who had sweated and bled to give him a better life than I had, who had given up my dream of a bigger workshop to take a steady job at a construction firm so he could go to college. I was worthless. I didn't feel anger. The anger evaporated, leaving only a cold, empty clarity. I saw everything. I saw my son, a man consumed by his own insecurities. I saw my daughter-in-law, a selfish manipulator who despised anything she couldn't buy with money. Slowly, I placed my knife and fork down parallel to each other on the plate. I lifted my head and looked directly into Donovan's eyes. For the first time in months, I truly saw him, and he flinched under my gaze. I looked over at Heather. The smile was gone from her face, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. I nodded a slow, deliberate nod. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. I understand. Then I stood up, gently pushed my chair under the table, and walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back. I knew in that moment that something was over, and something else entirely new was just beginning. The stairs to the basement creaked under my feet, a familiar, comforting sound. The air down here was cool, carrying the distinct smell of pine sawdust, linseed oil, and old metal. My workshop. This place was a world away from the sterile pretense upstairs. Everything was in its place. Chisels lined up by size. Handsaws hung neatly on the wall. A fine layer of sawdust coated the workbench, sparkling like gold dust under the single yellow bulb. This was my kingdom, my sanctuary. I walked to the far end of the shop to an old workbench. On it, amidst blueprints and scraps of wood, was a picture frame. I picked it up gently, wiping the dust from the glass. It was Martha. She was smiling, her eyes bright with joy, standing in front of the house when it was just a timber skeleton. I remembered that day perfectly. We had used all our savings, taken out loans to buy this plot of land. People said we were crazy. A black carpenter building a house in this neighborhood. Caleb, that's a white folks area. They'd said, but Martha believed in me. She believed in these hands. You'll build us a home, she'd said, a home nobody can ever take from us. And I did. I poured the foundation myself, framed the walls, laid the roof. I built every kitchen cabinet, every window frame. Donovan grew up to the sound of hammers and saws. He used to follow me around this workshop, his eyes wide with curiosity. I taught him the difference between oak and maple, how to drive a nail straight. He used to be proud of his father. He used to tell his friends, "My dad built our whole house." What changed? I set the frame down, my hand trembling slightly. Maybe it was the money or Heather. Or maybe I had failed somewhere. Maybe I was so focused on giving him the things I never had that I forgot to teach him the value of the things that can't be bought. I sat down on an old stool and looked around the workshop. Every tool, every scratch on the floor told a story. That planer, I bought it with my first paycheck after Donovan was born. This hammer, it was my father's. This wasn't just a room. It was my legacy. It was the story of the Jones family, and they wanted to turn it into a gym. A cold resolve settled deep in my bones. It wasn't sadness. It was determination. Martha's last words to me before the cancer took her came back to me. She had gripped my hand, her voice a whisper. "Don't ever let them forget where we came from, Caleb. This house is more than wood and nails. It's our story. Protect it." I had been silent for too long. I had backed down too many times for the sake of keeping the peace. But this wasn't peace. It was surrender. I had allowed my son and his wife to slowly erase our story to replace it with Italian marble and fancy parties. I stood up. I knew what I had to do. The decision that formed in my mind wasn't born of sudden anger, but from the dull ache of years and the cold clarity of the last 10 minutes. I walked to an old metal locker in the corner and unlocked it. Inside, beneath a stack of old papers, was an old flip phone, a burner phone. No internet, no GPS, just calls. I powered it on. The small screen lit up, showing a contacts list with only a few names. I found the one I was looking for. Lawrence, Martha's brother, a lawyer. My finger hovered over the keypad. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of sawdust fill my lungs and give me strength. It was time to protect our story. The phone rang 3 times on the other end before it was picked up. "Hello." Lawrence's voice was thick with sleep, but still held its usual sharpness. "Lawrence, it's me, Caleb." There was a short pause. Then I heard a rustling sound as if he was sitting up in bed. "Caleb, is everything all right? You're using the old number?" "No, everything is not all right, but it's about to be," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm sorry for calling so late." "Don't be. What's happened?" His voice was fully awake now. He knew me. I wasn't a man who made midnight calls just to chat. I didn't answer his question directly. I got straight to the point. The deed for the house on Willow Creek, the original one, the one Martha and I signed. "You still have it, right?" Another pause. This one was heavier, filled with unspoken understanding. Lawrence had seen it all. He'd seen Donovan change. He'd warned me about Heather. He was there when I had to use my retirement savings to bail Donovan out of his failed business ventures. He knew this call was coming sooner or later. "Of course I still have it, Caleb," he finally said, his tone serious. "It's safe in the office vault. The names on that title are Caleb Jones and Martha Jones. It's never been changed." A wave of relief washed over me. That was the first brick, the foundation for everything that was about to happen. "Good," I said. "I need you to do something for me." I'm listening. I want you to get the paperwork ready. It's time. I didn't have to specify what it was time for. Lawrence knew. We had discussed this possibility, a contingency plan sketched out on a quiet afternoon years ago when Donovan and Heather's entitlement was just beginning to show. A plan I had prayed I would never have to use. Are you sure, Caleb? Lawrence asked, and I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice, not questioning the legality of it, but checking on me as a brother-in-law. I looked around my workshop at the legacy Martha and I had built together. I pictured Donovan's eyes, Heather's smirk. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Lawrence, I replied, my voice as solid as oak. Let's begin in the morning. All right, Caleb, I'll call you first thing. You take care of yourself. Thank you, Lawrence. I closed the phone. The small plastic click echoed in the quiet of the workshop. It was done. The machine was in motion. There was no turning back now. I didn't feel happy or vindicated. I just felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like a guest in my own home. I was its owner, and I was about to take it back. Lawrence's office was on the 30th floor of a glass tower that scraped the Austin sky. It was a world of polished mahogany, leather-bound books, and quiet efficiency. A world away from the honest scent of sawdust and oil in my workshop. I sat in a heavy leather chair that sighed as I settled into it, feeling out of place in my simple work pants and clean flannel shirt. Lawrence sat across from me, his desk a wide expanse of perfect wood. He wasn't just my lawyer. He was Martha's little brother. In his eyes, I could see the same sharp intelligence that had always been in hers. He slid a thick vellum document across the desk, its edges softened by age. The seal of the Travis County clerk was still crisp. This is it, Caleb, he said, his voice low and steady. The original grant deed from 1985. I leaned forward, my hands clasped together on the desk. My eyes found our names typed in a font I hadn't seen in years. Caleb Jones and Martha Jones. Seeing her name there felt like a punch to the gut and a comfort all at once. It was a tangible piece of her, a solid proof of the life we had built together. Lawrence pointed a manicured finger at a specific line. Look here, the grantees, Caleb Jones and Martha Jones, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. That was a legal term Martha and I had discussed with a younger Lawrence all those years ago. It meant that if one of us passed, the other would automatically inherit the entire property without it having to go through the courts. It was a promise of protection, a promise that the survivor would always have a home. Upon Martha's passing, he continued, his voice, gentle but firm, full and indivisible ownership of the property transferred solely to you. Her share vanished, and yours expanded to 100%. The house became yours and yours alone. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then he looked me straight in the eye, his expression serious. I've reviewed every public record for the last 5 years, Caleb, just to be absolutely certain. Donovan's name is not on this deed. Heather's name is not on this deed. There has never been a transfer of title. Not a quitclaim, not a sale, nothing. He tapped the document for emphasis. This is the only legally binding proof of ownership, and it says the house belongs to you. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. So the house is still mine? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It felt strange to have to ask the question about the home I had built with my own hands. Lawrence leaned back in his chair. It has always been yours, Caleb. 100%. The property taxes are paid from an account you fund, even if Donovan makes the electronic transfer. The homeowner's insurance is in your name. Every legal tie this house has is to you and the memory of my sister. Legally speaking, your son and his wife are tenants. Guests in your home. They have paid no rent and have no lease. They have no ownership rights, none whatsoever. The words didn't bring me joy. They brought a heavy, cold certainty. All of Donovan and Heather's arrogance, their casual dismissal of my life's work, their plans to tear down walls and rip out floors. It was all built on a fantasy of ownership they felt so entitled to they never even bothered to check the paperwork. They just assumed it was theirs, just as they assumed I was a relic, a piece of old furniture to be managed and eventually discarded. The law, the simple black and white truth of it, was on my side, and for the first time, it felt like a weapon I was finally ready to use. I looked at the deed at Martha's name one last time. Then I looked at Lawrence. My resolve hardened from a painful idea into solid steel. All right, I said, my voice clear and strong. Let's talk about the next step. All right, I said, my voice clear and strong. Let's talk about the next step. Lawrence nodded, taking off his glasses and polishing them with a clean cloth. He was no longer just Martha's brother offering comfort. He was a lawyer, shifting into strategic mode. "The first thing we need to ensure is speed and discretion," he said, placing his glasses back on. "We don't put a sign on the lawn, Caleb. We don't list it on the public market. The moment it hits the MLS, Donovan will get an alert. He probably has a dozen of them set up for the neighborhood. He sees himself as the king of that castle. He'll want to know what the peasants are doing." The words were harsh but true. My son's pride was as vast as it was fragile. "So how do we sell it?" I asked. Lawrence leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "We do what's called an off-market sale. I have a colleague, a real estate broker, who specializes in this. She's the best in Austin. More importantly, she's loyal. She works with a private list of pre-qualified, high net worth individuals. We tell her we're looking for a cash buyer. No banks, no appraisals, no lengthy loan approvals. A cash offer means we can close in as little as 10 days. Before Donovan even realizes what's happening, the ink will be dry and the house will be sold. Selling it. The thought sent a pang of grief through me, so sharp it took my breath away. Selling the walls I had raised, the floors Martha had danced on. It felt like a betrayal of our memory. But then I saw Heather's smirk in my mind, heard Donovan's voice calling me worthless. And I knew this wasn't a betrayal of Martha's legacy. It was the only way to protect it. I gave Lawrence a firm nod. "Find the buyer." He nodded back, satisfied with my resolve. "Now for the second and more important piece of this. Caleb, the money. The $2.4 million can't just sit in your bank account. It needs a purpose. It needs protection. I suggest we create an irrevocable trust." He explained that an irrevocable trust was like a fortress. Once the money was inside, it couldn't be touched by lawsuits, creditors, or family members seeking a handout. It would be safe. "We'll call it the Martha Jones Legacy Trust." Proposed her name spoken in this context of strength and permanence felt right. It felt just, and what does this trust do? I asked its primary purpose. Lawrence said, a hint of a smile touching his lips, will be to fund vocational training scholarships. Woodworking mechanics, electricians for underprivileged kids here in Austin. The kind of skills you value. The kind of start you and Martha never had. It will be a testament to what you built, not with money, but with your hands. The idea was perfect. It was a legacy of creation, not of consumption. It was everything I believed in. Everything Donovan had forgotten. "My son, he'll be written out then," I stated more than asked. "This is where the lesson comes in." Lawrence said, "We don't just write him out. We give him a path, a hard one. He will be named as a tertiary beneficiary, but with conditions so strict they will either make him a better man or he'll get nothing at all." He pulled out a notepad and began to write as he spoke. Condition 1, he must complete at least 2 years of documented financial counseling from an accredited professional. Condition 2, he must hold a steady job for a minimum of 5 consecutive years without seeking any financial aid from the trust or from you. And condition 3, he must perform 500 hours of verifiable community service for one of the charities the trust supports. Only after meeting all of these requirements can he petition the trust board for a modest annual stipend. Not before. I listened as he laid out the terms. It wasn't a punishment. It was a blueprint. A blueprint for the man I had always hoped Donovan would become. It gave him a chance not to get his money back, but to earn his self-respect back. It was the hardest, most loving thing I could possibly do for him. "Do it, Lawrence," I said, my voice thick with emotion, but unwavering. "Set it all up exactly as you said." The fortress was no longer just an idea. We were drawing the plans, and soon we would lay the first stone. A few days after my meeting with Lawrence, a strange calm settled over the house. It was the calm before a storm. I knew the wheels were in motion, but on the surface, life continued as normal. I was in the living room, quietly oiling the joints of a rocking chair I had made for Martha when she was pregnant with Donovan. The rhythmic motion of the cloth on the wood was soothing a familiar ritual in a world that felt increasingly unfamiliar. That's when Heather walked in, followed by a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, thin, and wore a black turtleneck despite the Texas heat. He carried a sleek tablet like a shield. "Caleb, this is Julian," she said, her voice bright and dismissive. "Julian is a designer. He's going to help us refresh the space." Julian gave me a curtain nod, his eyes sweeping over me in the rocking chair, with a look of professional pity before moving on to scan the room. I said nothing, just continued my work, a ghost in my own home. "So, this is the main living area," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the high ceiling room. "Good bones. Definitely good bones, but it's all very heavy." Heather followed him as he glided across the floor, his expensive shoes silent on the pine planks. I know, right? She sighed dramatically. That's what I've been telling Donovan for years. It's so dark. The first thing to go has to be these floors. I ran my cloth over a knot in the wood of the chair. I remembered finding that piece of lumber. It had a flaw, a beautiful swirling grain that others might have discarded, but I saw its character. I made it the centerpiece of the chair's back. Martha had loved it. Julian tapped his tablet. I agree. We can replace these dark planks with a polished concrete or a wide plank white oak. It would open up the space immediately, give it a much cleaner European sensibility. And the fireplace? He continued, walking over to it. He ran a disdainful finger over the mantelpiece I had carved from a single piece of mesquite wood. I'd spent over 100 hours on it, carving the images of bluebonnet flowers and mocking birds, the things Martha loved. It's very rustic, he said the word like an insult. Very nines, we can reface this whole thing in slate. Clean lines, minimalist. My hand stopped moving on the rocking chair. I remembered a cold winter night with the fire roaring Donovan as a small boy tracing the carved birds with his little fingers, asking me to tell him their names again and again. And these built-in bookshelves, Heather added, gesturing to the wall of shelves I had constructed around the fireplace. They just collect clutter. I envisioned this entire wall being flat white. Maybe space for one large piece of art. It's all about negative space now, Julian. Negative space, I thought to myself. That's what they wanted to turn my life's work into. An empty void. They walked through the room, deconstructing my life piece by piece, their voices a clinical buzz of brand names and design trends. They saw walls and floors. I saw memories and promises. They saw a house. I saw a home. Finally, they drifted towards the hallway that led to the basement door and the downstairs area. Julian prompted. Oh, that has the most potential of all, Heather said with a laugh. Right now, it's just a dusty old workshop. But I see a full home gym, mirrors on one wall, a Peloton sauna. It'll be a complete wellness center. My knuckles were white as I gripped the arm of the rocking chair. They weren't just talking about a room. They were talking about my soul. The designer nodded enthusiastically. A fantastic use of the square footage. The conversion would be straightforward. Heather paused by the door and turned to him, lowering her voice conspiratorially as if sharing a secret, though it was loud enough for me to hear clearly. Of course, she said with a light, airy tone. All of this can only happen once we've sorted out the current living arrangements. We're just waiting for my father-in-law to move into a nice, manageable little place so we can finally make this house our own. A nice, manageable little place like an old dog being sent to a farm. Julian smiled obliviously. Oh, of course. Downsizing is so practical at that age. I didn't look at them. I focused on the wood in my hands, on the familiar grain on the memory of Martha's smile. They weren't just erasing wood and stone. They were trying to erase me, erase Martha, erase our story. That evening, I went down to my workshop. I took out my old leather-bound journal and I wrote down their words, date, and time. Not for a court, not for Lawrence, but for myself. It was the final piece of evidence I needed to remind my own conscience that what I was about to do was not an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation. As the front door clicked shut behind them, their voices and laughter faded, leaving a silence that felt louder and colder than before. I didn't move. I remained by the rocking chair, the oiling cloth still in my hand. My heart was not pounding. My hands were not shaking. A strange and terrible calm had settled over me. I had just listened to the detailed plan for the demolition of my life, and all I felt was a profound and icy clarity. They thought I was a ghost, an invisible old man who was deaf to their whispers. But I had heard every word. Dark, heavy planks. That's what she had called the floors. I remembered carrying those pine boards on my own back up the hill from the lumber yard, because the delivery truck couldn't make it up our muddy, unpaved road back then. Martha had cheered me on from the porch. We had stained them a deep, rich color together on our hands and knees, laughing as we smudged it on each other's faces. They weren't dark, they were warm. They held the memory of sunlight. Rustic, the word the designer had used for my mantelpiece. I remembered finding that piece of mesquite wood on a trip to the hill country. It was gnarled and imperfect. It took me 100 hours to carve it smooth to find the story within the grain. The story of our life in Texas. I finished it on our 20th anniversary. When I installed it, Martha had traced the lines of the carved bluebonnets with tears in her eyes and told me it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. To them, it was just a dated feature to be covered over with cold slate. And my workshop, my sanctuary, A dusty old room to be gutted and replaced with mirrors and machines. They saw dust. I saw the particles of every project I had ever brought to life. The cradle I built for Donovan. The kitchen table we were just sitting at. The casket I made for my own father. They saw a waste of space. I saw the very soul of our home. But the words that truly settled in my heart, like chips of ice, were hers. A nice, manageable little place. That's where they wanted to put me. A place where I would be out of sight, out of mind. A place where I would no longer be a silent reminder of the humble beginnings they were so desperate to erase. They weren't just redecorating a house. They were trying to gentrify their own history to tear down the foundation of their lives and build a new shiny facade on top of it. A facade built on my sweat and Martha's dreams. Slowly, I folded the oiling cloth and placed it neatly on the arm of the rocking chair. I walked through the silent living room, my feet sure and steady on the floors I had laid. I went down the stairs to my workshop. The air down here felt different now. It wasn't just a sanctuary, it was an armory. I walked over to the old metal locker and pulled out a leather-bound journal. It was a gift from Martha, one of the last she ever gave me. I opened it to a clean page. I took a pen and under the date, I began to write. I wrote down their words exactly as I remembered them. The talk of Italian marble and polished concrete. The dismissal of my mantelpiece, the plan for a wellness center, and I wrote her final sentence. We're just waiting for my father-in-law to move into a nice, manageable little place. I wrote it all down in a clear, steady hand. It was not a diary of my feelings. It was a record, a testament. It was the final proof I needed for my own conscience, that the course I had set was not only necessary, it was just. My grief had become evidence. My pain had become purpose. And my quiet plan was now an unbreakable promise to the memory of the woman I loved and the life we had built. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I retreated to my workshop, trying to lose myself in the familiar scent of cedar and the patient work of my hands. I was restoring an old rocking horse for a neighbor's grandchild. The act of taking something broken and making it whole again was the only thing that kept my mind from splintering. Every time the floorboards creaked upstairs, I would freeze, wondering if they suspected anything. But Donovan and Heather were too absorbed in their own world of lavish plans and casual cruelties to notice the storm gathering right beneath their feet. I was carefully sanding the curved head of the horse when the sound I was waiting for finally came. It wasn't the house phone. It was the sharp, jarring ring of the old flip phone I kept hidden in a metal box. It was Lawrence. I wiped my dusty hands on my jeans and answered, "Caleb, it's Lawrence." His voice was calm, all business. My contact came through. "We have a buyer." My heart gave a single hard thud against my ribs. It was a feeling of both dread and relief. The finality of it was like a tidal wave pulling the ground out from under me. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "What's the offer?" "A young couple," Lawrence said. "Both are surgeons at St. David's. They just relocated from Baltimore. They've been looking for months for something with character, not another one of those glass and steel boxes that are popping up all over the city." I braced myself for the next part in the offer. They're offering full asking price, 2.4, $4 million, all cash. No contingencies, no appraisal needed. They can close in 10 days, Caleb. It's as clean a deal as you could ever hope for. I closed my eyes, picturing the house, the life Martha and I had poured into it. I needed to know it would be in good hands. What did they say about the house?" I asked. There was a pause and I could hear Lawrence smile through the phone. "This is the best part, Caleb." The agent showed them the private photos. She said they were most impressed by the woodwork, the mantel, the built-in shelves, the floors. They asked about the craftsman who built it. They wanted to preserve it all. The words were a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. All this time, I had been focused on the act of taking something away from Donovan. But now, for the first time, I saw this as an act of giving. I was giving our home a future. I was passing our story into the hands of people who would read it with respect, not tear out the pages. Donovan and Heather had seen a replaceable asset. This new couple saw a legacy. They saw the love. My decision solidified, no longer an act of anger, but one of pure purpose. "Tell them yes, Lawrence," I said, my voice clear and certain. "We accept the offer." "I'll draw up the purchase agreement immediately," Lawrence replied, his voice all business again. "Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon to sign 3 hours? Use the back entrance. I'll be there." I ended the call and placed the phone back in its metal box. I turned back to the rocking horse in front of me. I picked up my sandpaper and with a steady hand continued my work. A chapter was closing, but the story of the house on Willow Creek was not over. I was simply choosing its next authors. The next afternoon I drove to a part of Austin I rarely visited. It was a neighborhood of new glass-walled office buildings and trendy cafes where young people stared intently at their laptops. Lawrence had chosen a title company here deliberately. It was anonymous, neutral ground. As I drove, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. I wore my clean work clothes, not a suit. This was not a celebration, it was a solemn duty, a promise I had to keep. I thought about the first drive Martha and I ever took to the plot of land on Willow Creek. It was all dirt roads and live oaks back then. We had a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches and a dream that felt bigger than the Texas sky. Now I was driving to sign that dream away. But I knew in my heart I wasn't destroying it. I was saving it from those who didn't understand its value. I used the back entrance as Lawrence had instructed. He was waiting for me in a sterile conference room. The only other person present was a woman with sharp eyes and a professional smile who introduced herself as Ms. Davis, the escrow agent. The buyers were not there. This was a quiet transaction meant to be done without fanfare. A mountain of paperwork was stacked neatly in the center of a long, polished table. It looked like a tombstone. Miss Davis was efficient, her voice a calm monotone as she guided me through the stack. Initial here, sign here, date here. Each page was a legal requirement, a small step in the complex dance of transferring ownership. I signed papers acknowledging property disclosures, tax statements, and settlement fees. My hand moved automatically, steady and sure. With each signature, I felt not a sense of loss, but a growing sense of resolve. I was not giving up a piece of myself. I was cutting away a cancer that had grown in my family. Finally, she slid the last document in front of me. It was the deed, the document that would transfer the house I built into the hands of strangers. She pointed to a single line at the bottom. "Your full legal signature here, Mr. Jones." I picked up the heavy pen. Its weight felt significant in my hand. For a moment, the room faded away. I wasn't in a cold office building. I was back in the half-finished frame of my house with Martha. I could smell the fresh-cut pine and hear her laughing as I nearly dropped a hammer on my foot. I remembered her tracing their names on a dusty 2x4. The Jones house she had written forever. I thought of Donovan and Heather. I didn't picture their anger or their shock. Instead, I pictured their casual dismissal of my life's work. The wave of a hand that erased my fireplace mantle. The careless words that turned my workshop into a space for a treadmill. They hadn't just insulted me. They had insulted Martha's memory. They had taken the sacred thing we had built and declared it worthless. My promise to her echoed in my soul. Protect our story. This signature was not an act of revenge. Revenge is a hot, angry emotion. What I felt was a cold, righteous purpose. This was an act of justice. It was an act of preservation. I was not destroying Donovan's inheritance. He had already destroyed it himself when he chose a life of materialism and disrespect over one of integrity and love. I was simply signing the death certificate of an inheritance that had died in his heart years ago. With this single act, I was transforming our home from a source of conflict and pain into a wellspring of hope. The money from this sale would become the Martha Jones Legacy Trust. It would fund the dreams of young kids who had nothing but skill in their hands and hope in their hearts. Kids like I used to be. Martha would have loved that. Our story wouldn't end with Donovan's entitlement. It would begin again with every scholarship given, every career launched. The true legacy wasn't the house itself. It was the values with which we built it. I brought the pen to the paper, the tip pressed against the crisp fiber. I wrote my name clearly and firmly, Caleb Jones. It wasn't the shaky signature of a defeated old man. It was the bold script of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. It was done. Miss Davis took the document, her professional smile never wavering. She pressed a heavy seal into the corner, then stamped it with a loud final thud that echoed in the quiet room, the sound of a door closing forever. Lawrence placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of support. I stood up, shook Miss Davis's hand, and walked out of the conference room. When I stepped outside, the afternoon sun was bright. I didn't look back at the glass tower. I got in my truck and started the engine. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had not lost a home. I had reclaimed my soul. The storm was coming. I knew that. But for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid. I was ready. The day the papers were finalized was quiet. The 10 days that followed were quieter still. I moved through the house like a phantom, a keeper of a secret that was about to detonate the lives of everyone inside it. Donovan and Heather mistook my silence for submission. They saw it as a sign that the old man had finally accepted his place. To celebrate their perceived victory, they decided to throw a party. The house, which had been so silent for so long, was suddenly filled with noise. Loud music, the clinking of glasses, and the braying laughter of people who measured their worth in stock options and European cars. I stayed in my room for most of it, but eventually came down for a glass of water. No one paid me much attention. I was just a piece of the old furniture, a relic soon to be cleared out. I stood by the staircase in the shadows, and I watched my son. Donovan was holding court in the center of the living room, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. He gestured expansively at the room, his voice booming with false confidence for a group of his colleagues. "The bones of this place are incredible," he boasted. "My dad did a solid job back in the day. But it's time to bring it into the 21st century. We're blowing out this entire wall," he said, pointing to the wall that separated the living room from the dining area. "Create a true open-concept space. The sightlines will be incredible." One of his friends clapped him on the shoulder. "That's a hell of an undertaking, Donovan. It'll cost a fortune." Donovan laughed a hollow sound. "You got to spend money to make money, right? This house is our biggest asset. We have to maximize its value." Meanwhile, Heather was leading her own tour near the fireplace. "Julian, our designer, is a genius," she cooed to a circle of women adorned in jewelry that glittered coldly under the lights. "We're sourcing the marble for the floors directly from Carrara, and the mantel," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the mesquite wood I had so carefully carved, "will be replaced with a single slab of black granite. So much cleaner, so much more powerful." I listened to them sell a future that had already been sold. They were drawing blueprints on a property that was no longer theirs. Every boast was a lie. Every plan was a fantasy, and I felt nothing but a profound and weary sadness. I saw my son not as a villain, but as a lost and hollow man, desperately trying to build a sense of self-worth out of things he could buy instead of things he could be. He was performing a play for an audience of people who didn't care about him, only about his success. Martha would have wept to see our home filled with such empty noise. Donovan raised his glass high, silencing the room. "A toast," he shouted, "to the future, to bigger and better things, and to the Jones family estate. May it stand for another 100 years." As the guests cheered and clinked their glasses together, a sound cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was clear and final. The sound of the doorbell. My heart didn't leap. It settled. The hour had come. The curtain was about to rise on the final act, and I was the only one in the room who knew how the play was going to end. The toast was still hanging in the air, the words, Jones family estate, echoing with a bitter irony that only I could appreciate when the doorbell rang. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the music and laughter like a surgeon's scalpel. A few people turned their heads, annoyed at the interruption. Donovan sighed theatrically, rolling his eyes. "Can you believe it? Probably someone trying to sell us something." He looked at Heather. "I'll get it," he said with the air of a man deeply inconvenienced. I remained in the shadows by the staircase, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. This was it, the first tremor before the earthquake. Donovan swung the heavy oak door open, a look of entitled annoyance on his face, ready to dismiss whoever dared to interrupt his performance. But the look on his face faltered. It slid from arrogance to confusion, then to a flicker of alarm. Standing on the porch under the warm yellow light was my brother-in-law, Lawrence. He was dressed in a sharp suit, holding a leather briefcase. He was not alone. Beside him stood a man and a woman, both in their late 30s. They looked calm, professional, and entirely out of place amidst the loud, self-congratulatory atmosphere of the party. Uncle Lawrence, Donovan stammered. What are you doing here? Who are these people? Lawrence's expression was neutral, perfectly calm. Good evening, Donovan. I apologize for the intrusion. He gestured to the couple beside him. I'm here with Dr. Eris Thorne and Dr. Lena Thorne. By now, Heather had made her way to the door, her smile tight with irritation. Lawrence, this is hardly the time for a social call. We have guests. She barely glanced at the couple. Her dismissal of them was total. Lawrence didn't even look at her. He continued speaking to the Thornes, his voice clear and professional. Dr. and Dr. Thorne, this is Donovan Jones and his wife Heather. They have been residing at the property. The word hung in the air. Residing, not living, not owning. Residing. It was a lawyer's word, precise and deadly. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped forward slightly. He had a kind but serious face. It's a pleasure to meet you, he said, his voice polite but firm. We truly didn't mean to intrude on your gathering. Our agent mentioned this might be a good time for us to stop by and see the house in person for the first time as the official owners. We finalized the purchase this morning. The bomb had been dropped. Official owners finalized the purchase. The words seemed to suck all the air out of the doorway. The music from inside suddenly sounded tiny and ridiculous. Donovan stared at them, his mouth slightly open. He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. A joke? Is this some kind of joke, Uncle Lawrence? What are you talking about, purchase? Our house isn't for sale. Heather stepped in front of Donovan, her voice sharp as glass. This is absurd. This is our home, Lawrence. I don't know what kind of pathetic stunt you and that old man are trying to pull, but you need to leave now before I call the police. Lawrence remained completely unfazed by her threat. He looked past her, his eyes finding me in the shadows for a brief moment. I gave him the slightest of nods. It was all the confirmation he needed. He turned his attention back to my son. It's no joke, Donovan. The sale was finalized at 10:00 a.m. this morning. The property at 125 Willow Creek Lane was sold by its sole legal owner. He paused, letting the words sink in. Your father. The silence that followed was absolute. The party behind them had died. Every guest was now frozen, watching the drama unfold at the front door. Donovan's face had gone pale. He looked from Lawrence to the polite but unmoving couple, then back to Lawrence. He was searching for a sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Lawrence calmly opened his briefcase. He took out a single crisp document, a certified copy of the newly recorded deed. Perhaps this will clarify things for you, he said, holding it out. The names Eris Thorne and Lena Thorne were clearly visible at the top. Donovan didn't take the paper. He couldn't. His eyes were wide with a dawning horror. He looked past everyone, past the silent party guests, past the new owners of his life. His gaze finally landed on me, standing in the shadows, and in his eyes I saw the first terrifying flicker of understanding. The castle he had built was made of sand, and the tide had just come in. The silence in the room was a physical thing. It pressed in on us heavy and absolute. Every single one of their guests was frozen, a gallery of shocked faces illuminated by the cold light of the chandelier. Donovan and Heather stood in the doorway, their faces a canvas of disbelief. It was Donovan who broke the spell first, not with a shout, but with a choked laugh, a sound that was more panic than humor. Okay, he said, shaking his head and looking around at his friends. Okay, very funny, Dad, you got me. This is a hell of a prank. Hiring actors, seriously, he pointed a trembling finger at the Thornes. And Uncle Lawrence, you're in on this too. Wow. You really went all out. He was trying to frame it as a joke to save face in front of the audience he had so carefully curated. He was trying to convince himself. Heather quickly caught on, her voice sharp with a desperate attempt at control. The joke is over, Caleb. It was never funny to begin with. You've had your little moment now. Tell your friends to leave. She waved a dismissive hand at Lawrence and the Thornes. You're embarrassing us. I remained silent in the shadows, letting their denial play out. Lawrence didn't engage with their fiction. This is not a prank, Heather, he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. Dr. and Dr. Thorne are the legal owners of this property as of 10 a.m. this morning. Dr. Lena Thorne, one of the new owners, spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm and measured, the voice of a surgeon used to delivering difficult news. Mr. Jones, Mrs. Jones, we understand this is a shock. We were told the property would be vacated upon closing. We are not here to cause a scene, but we are here to see our new home. Her polite firmness was a wall they couldn't break through. The word home coming from her lips seemed to finally crack their delusion. The disbelief in Donovan's eyes began to curdle into rage. The public humiliation was setting in. He turned from the door and his eyes locked on me. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You!" he snarled, his voice low and shaking. "How could you do this? This is my house. I live here. I pay the bills. You have no right." I listened to him scream about the bills he paid. I thought of the generous allowance I had deposited into his account every month for the last 10 years, an account he thought was funded by a vague family trust, but was in fact funded directly by me. I thought of the property taxes and insurance premiums that were paid automatically from my own retirement savings. He had been living in a world I had built for him, and he was so arrogant he thought he had built it himself. Heather's rage was hotter and faster. She whirled on Lawrence. "You traitor! How could you do this to your own family? My husband trusted you. We will have you disbarred for this." She then turned her venom on the thorns. Get out of our house. You are trespassing. I am calling the police right now." She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking with fury. Donovan took another step towards the doorway, closing the distance to Lawrence. "Get them out of here, Lawrence!" he growled, grabbing his uncle's arm. "Get them out of here now, or I swear I will throw you out myself." The chaos was escalating. Their guests were starting to back away, murmuring amongst themselves, sensing the danger of a cornered animal. But Lawrence did not flinch. He looked down at Donovan's hand on his arm, and then back up at his nephew's face. "Donovan, I suggest you take your hand off me," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "And Heather, by all means, please call the police. I have a certified copy of the grant deed right here for them to review. In fact, I welcome it. I am sure they will be very interested in helping the legal owners of this property secure it from any unauthorized residents." Unauthorized residents. The legal term hung in the air, colder and sharper than any insult. It redefined them instantly. They were not hosts. They were not owners. They were squatters. The fight drained out of them in an instant, replaced by a tidal wave of pure panic. Heather froze her thumb, hovering over her phone screen. Donovan's hand dropped from Lawrence's arm as if he'd been burned. Their eyes darted around the room at the faces of their friends who were now staring at them with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The entire foundation of their world, their status, their wealth, their beautiful home had just been turned to dust in front of everyone they had been trying so desperately to impress. Their performance was over, and all that was left was the ugly truth. They looked at the calm new owners. They looked at the immovable lawyer, and then finally their terrified, pleading eyes turned back to me, the silent old man in the corner, who they had called worthless. And for the first time they saw me not as a relic, but as the architect of their complete and total ruin. The stunned silence in the room was thick with humiliation. Donovan and Heather stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale masks of disbelief. The party was over. Their friends and colleagues were now just spectators at a public execution of their reputation. Donovan's eyes darted between the calm new owners. The impassive lawyer in me. He was a cornered animal searching for an escape that didn't exist. He had built his identity on the foundation of this house, on the perception of wealth and ownership. And now that foundation was gone. Lawrence, seeing that the initial shock had given way to a paralyzing despair, decided it was time for the final blow. He reached into his leather briefcase once more. His movements were slow, deliberate, and professional. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was simply executing a plan. He produced a long white envelope. It was a certified mail envelope with a green return receipt card attached. It looked official, formal, and final. He stepped forward, holding the envelope out to Donovan. "I believe this is for you," he said, his voice even and devoid of emotion. Donovan stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't move to take it. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice. "It's a formal notice," Lawrence explained calmly. "A 30-day notice to quit. It outlines your legal obligation to vacate the premises, which are now the legal property of Dr. Thorne. It also includes a copy of the new deed and a letter from your father explaining his actions and the establishment of the Martha Jones legacy. Trust. It's all there in black and white. Legally binding and court enforceable. This was not a negotiation. It was not a discussion. It was the final word. The certified letter was the weapon that ended the war. It was proof. It was the law. It was the cold, hard consequence of their own actions delivered in a simple white envelope. The weight of that envelope seemed to fill the entire room. It was heavier than the house itself because it contained not just legal notices but the full weight of the truth they had refused to see. The truth that they were not owners but guests and their stay was officially over. I watched the last vestiges of fight drain from my son's face, leaving behind the hollowed-out look of utter defeat. The chaos had burned itself out. All that remained was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the heavy breathing of a room full of people who wished they were anywhere else. I took a slow step out of the shadows. I didn't look at Donovan or Heather. My gaze was fixed on Lawrence. His eyes met mine and he understood. I gave a single deliberate nod. "Lawrence," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the silent room. "Please read them the letter." Lawrence reached into the certified mail envelope and pulled out 2 folded pages. It was my handwriting transcribed by him onto his official letterhead. He unfolded the pages and began to read, his voice, a calm, dispassionate instrument of truth. He began to my son Donovan. "I am writing this letter not out of anger but out of a profound sadness. For many years I have watched the man I raised disappear, replaced by a stranger who values things more than people. I have stayed silent, hoping you would find your way back. But I have come to realize that my silence was not peace. It was permission. My permission for you to disrespect me, to disrespect the memory of your mother, and to disrespect the very foundation our family was built on." As Lawrence spoke, I watched Heather's face. Her defiant anger was gone, replaced by a pale, sickly apprehension. She knew what was coming. Lawrence continued. "On the evening of September 28th, I sat in the living room while your wife Heather and her designer discussed their plans for this house. Heather referred to the pine floors I laid with your mother as dark, heavy planks. She called the mantelpiece I spent 100 red hours carving for Martha Rustic and dated. She called my workshop the place where I taught you how to hold your first hammer, a dusty old room that would be gutted to make a wellness center." I saw a flicker of shame on Heather's face as her own words were thrown back at her in the cold light of this public forum. She looked away, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Lawrence's voice never wavered. Later in that same conversation, Heather stated her intention to move me into a nice, manageable little place so that the two of you could finally make this house your own. And then, Donovan, after I sat through all of this in silence, you looked at me in the home I built for our family, the home that sheltered you, and you said, "You just sit here, eat our food, and don't help with anything. You're becoming worthless." At the sound of his own words, my son flinched as if struck. A low murmur went through the remaining guests. They started to understand. This wasn't a sudden, cruel act. This was a consequence, a bill that had finally come due. The letter went on. "A home is not an asset to be leveraged, Donovan. It is a story. It is a legacy. And you have made it painfully clear that you wish to erase our story. You are ashamed of it. You are ashamed of me. Therefore, I can no longer allow you to be the custodian of that legacy. You cannot honor what you do not value. For this reason, as is my legal and moral right, I have sold the property at 125 Willow Creek Lane. This letter serves as your formal and legal 30-day notice to vacate the premises." The legal language was a hammer blow, a final cold reality from which there was no escape. But I had one final thing to tell him, the part he could not possibly imagine. Lawrence took a breath before reading the final section. "The proceeds from the sale, $2.4 million, have not been placed in my bank account. They will not be used to fund my retirement. Instead, they have been used to create a new foundation in honor of the woman whose memory you have so carelessly disregarded. It is called the Martha Jones Legacy Trust. The trust will provide scholarships for young people in Austin to learn skilled trades like woodworking and mechanics. It will honor the values of hard work, integrity, and creating something of value with your own 2 hands. Values your mother cherished and values you have long since forgotten." This was the moment of absolute annihilation. I watched the final flicker of hope die in Donovan's eyes. The house was gone, and now the money was gone too. Not lost, not spent, but transformed into a monument of everything he had rejected. It was a perfect and devastating justice. Lawrence read the last few lines. "You are not a beneficiary of this trust, Donovan, but your mother would have wanted you to have a path back, not to the money, but to yourself. Your Uncle Lawrence holds the details of that path. It is a long and difficult one requiring humility, hard work, and a genuine change of heart. Whether you choose to walk, it is entirely up to you. I pray that one day you will find a value in yourself that has nothing to do with the things you own. Signed, your father, Caleb Jones." Lawrence neatly folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He set it on a nearby table. The room was now almost empty. The guests had evaporated, slipping out the back door, not wanting to be near the wreckage. All that was left was Donovan and Heather standing alone in the ruins of the life they thought they owned. They had lost their home, their inheritance, and their pride in the space of 10 minutes. Heather was openly weeping, now silent, bitter tears. Donovan just stared at the floor, a completely broken man. I looked at my son, not with triumph or hatred. All I felt was a deep and sorrowful pity. The storm had passed, and now came the long, quiet work of seeing what, if anything, could be rebuilt from the rubble. The last word of the letter faded into the oppressive silence of the room. Lawrence folded the pages with a quiet finality and placed them in the envelope on the table. The remaining guests, horrified and mesmerized, now began to truly melt away. They slipped out the back door, whispering apologies. Their escape from this domestic carnage was quiet and swift. Soon, the only people left were me, Lawrence the Thorns, who stood by the door looking profoundly uncomfortable, and the shattered remains of my son's family. Heather's quiet weeping was the only sound a soundtrack to their utter ruin. It was then that Donovan finally moved. He stumbled forward as if in a trance. He didn't look at his crying wife. He didn't look at the new owners of his home. He stumbled past the expensive furniture and the half-eaten party food, his eyes fixed only on me. When he was a few feet away from me, his legs seemed to give out. He fell to his knees on the very pine floors he had been so eager to rip out. The sound of his knees hitting the wood I had laid was a dull, sickening thud. "Dad." He choked out the word, a ragged sob. "Please. Dad. Don't do this. I'm sorry." "Okay, I'm sorry." He looked up at me, his face a mess of tears and desperation. A spoiled child who had finally been told no. "I didn't mean it. It was just words. Just stupid words. Please, Dad, this is our home. This is everything. You can't just give it away. You can't do this to me, to us, to your grandchildren." He was weaponizing children who he rarely brought to visit me. Children for whom I had built a treehouse in the backyard that they had never once used. Heather rushed forward, trying to pull him up. "Donovan, get up, get up. You're making a fool of yourself." But he was beyond her reach now. He shook her off, his focus entirely on me. I looked down at my 42-year-old son kneeling on the floor, and for a moment I didn't see a man. I saw the little boy who used to fall and scrape his knee, who would come to me crying, believing his father could fix any hurt. My heart ached with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. This was the moment I had worked towards the checkmate I had so carefully planned. And it brought me no joy, only a vast ocean of sorrow. I knew then that to give in to his pleas would be the cruelest thing I could do. To save him now would be to condemn him to a life of perpetual weakness and entitlement. The lesson had to be complete. The surgery had to be finished. I looked down at him, my face a mask of resolute sadness. I let him see the pain in my eyes. I wanted him to know this was not easy for me either, that this was an act not of vengeance but of a terrible necessary love. "You had everything, Donovan," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. A home built with love, a legacy of hard work, a father who would have given you anything, and you called it worthless. I let the truth of that statement settle over him. I saw the recognition in his eyes, the final understanding that this was a wound he had inflicted upon himself. I took a small step back. "So now you will learn the value of having nothing at all." Without another glance, I turned my back on my kneeling son, on my weeping daughter-in-law, on the silent new owners, on the wreckage of the life we once had. Lawrence fell into step beside me, a silent guardian. As I walked towards the front door, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a surgeon walking away from a difficult operation, hoping desperately that the patient would survive. I opened the door, the heavy oak door I had hung myself 30 years ago. I stepped out into the cool night air, and for the last time I walked away from the house on Willow Creek. I didn't look back. I left the chaos behind me for others to clean up. A new and uncertain chapter had begun, and the only thing I knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. I did not return to the house on Willow Creek. After that night, I stayed with Lawrence for a while before finding a small, quiet apartment of my own. I did not need to see them pack. My goal was not to witness their humiliation, but to deliver a necessary lesson. Lawrence handled the final handover of the keys, and he told me what he saw. I didn't need to be there. I could picture it all perfectly. The 30 days that followed, the party were not a period of defiance for Donovan and Heather. They were a slow, painful descent into reality. The friends who had filled our home with their loud laughter were suddenly silent. Their calls went unanswered. No one offered to help them pack. The spectacle of their downfall was something to be gossiped about from a distance, not something to be touched. I imagine Heather in the master bedroom, her face streaked with tears that were more angry than sad. The walk-in closet, once her prized showroom, was now a chaotic mess of cardboard boxes. I can see her wrapping her ridiculously expensive shoes and designer handbags in old newspaper. The luxury items looking dull and absurd in the grim light of her new reality. The woman who had dreamed of Italian marble was now faced with the humble cardboard and packing tape of a life unceremoniously dismantled. I can picture Donovan standing in the middle of the cavernous living room, surrounded by the oversized furniture he had bought to impress people who were no longer there. He would have discovered that the sleek, minimalist sofas and 10ft dining tables that looked so powerful in this house would not fit into the two-bedroom apartment they had been forced to rent. I imagine him on the phone trying to sell the pieces, for a fraction of what he paid, his voice tight with a shame he could no longer hide. The symbols of his success had become heavy monuments to his failure. Lawrence told me the silence of the house was broken only by their arguments. Sharp, bitter whispers that echoed in the empty rooms. "This is your fault, Donovan. You and your stupid pride. You just had to push him." And Donovan's reply, tired and defeated. "My fault. You were the one who wanted everything, Heather. The best of the best. It was never enough for you." Their partnership, a union built on the shaky foundation of materialism, was crumbling now that the foundation had been removed. They had nothing left but each other, and it was clear that was not enough. On the final day, I picture them carrying the last box out the front door. They wouldn't have looked back. To look back would be to face the full magnitude of what they had lost. The house stood behind them, silent and grand. It was no longer their stage. It was just a house again, empty, waiting. The sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It lit up the faint squares on the walls where their pretentious art used to hang. The house was finally at peace. It was just wood and nails and memories again. My memories. The poison had been drawn out. The wound was clean. As they drove away in their one remaining car, small and defeated, I felt no triumph. Just the somber quiet of a chapter finally closed. The house was ready for a new story, and so was I. The story of that night spread through Donovan and Heather's social circle like a lit fuse. The guests who had slipped out our back door became the first messengers carrying the tale of their host's spectacular implosion. It was a story too dramatic, too deliciously scandalous to be kept quiet. I imagine it was the topic of conversation at brunch tables and in country club locker rooms all over Austin. The fall of the House of Jones was public, and it was swift, but the public shame was only the beginning. Their real punishment came in the quiet, brutal language of finance. The first domino to fall was the credit cards. Lawrence had told me that Heather had tried to go shopping a few days after the move at one of her favorite high-end boutiques. She had picked out a new dress trying to wrap herself in the familiar comfort of expensive fabric. But when she went to pay, her card was declined. She tried another and another. All declined. I can see the scene perfectly. Her initial annoyance, turning to confusion, then to a hot flush of panicked shame as the young sales clerk looked at her with pity. She wouldn't have understood at first. What she didn't know was that the first call I made the morning after the party was to the bank to cancel every supplementary card I had ever issued. The lifeline that had funded her entire sense of self-worth had been severed. Next came the cars. They had two of them, a sleek German sedan for Donovan and a massive luxury SUV for Heather. Both were leased, and both leases I had foolishly co-signed years ago to help them get approved. With the accounts I funded now closed, the automatic payments stopped. The leasing company did not wait long. I picture the tow trucks arriving at their new cramped apartment complex, their lights flashing for all the new neighbors to see. The sight of those symbols of their affluence being unceremoniously hooked and dragged away must have been a uniquely modern form of public shaming. What Donovan and Heather were forced to learn was that their lifestyle had been a lie. Donovan's 6-figure salary, which sounded so impressive, was just a single pillar supporting a mansion of debt. The other pillar, the main one, had been the quiet, steady stream of money from my accounts, which he had always treated not as a gift, but as his due. Without my support, his income alone couldn't even cover the interest on their mountain of debt. And with the money went the friends. The calls stopped. The invitations to parties and weekend getaways vanished. Donovan and Heather were no longer assets in the competitive sport of social climbing. They were liabilities, a cautionary tale. Their friends, who had once praised their taste and ambition, now whispered about their downfall. The social world they had tried so desperately to conquer had turned its back on them without a second thought. I heard through Lawrence that the story had even reached Donovan's office. His authority, which had been built on a carefully crafted image of success and wealth, evaporated overnight. He was no longer the confident deal-maker. He was the man who had been publicly evicted by his own father. Their fall was not just financial. It was total. They had built their entire identity on the shifting sands of money and status. And when the tide went out, they were left with nothing. It was a brutal lesson, but it was the only lesson that could ever teach them the difference between the price of everything and the value of anything. Several months have passed since that night. I didn't stay with Lawrence for long. I found a small 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony that overlooks a park. It's quiet. In the mornings, I drink my coffee and watch the old men play chess. It's more than enough. I never wanted the big house back. The house had been a symbol of a promise I made to my wife. And once I had protected that promise, its purpose in my life was over. I didn't need the space or the status. I just needed peace. And for the first time in a long time, I have it. This morning I drove to a community center in East Austin. It's a loud, bustling place filled with the sounds of bouncing basketballs and excited kids. In the back of the building is a large workshop. The sign on the door read, "The Martha Jones Legacy Workshop." Lawrence had insisted on the name. I stood in the doorway and watched the first class. There were a dozen young people inside, boys and girls from the neighborhood all gathered around sturdy workbenches. The air was filled with the familiar, beautiful scent of freshly cut pine. An instructor, a woman with a kind face and sawdust in her hair, was showing them how to make a simple dovetail joint. The students were focused, their brows furrowed in concentration. The sound of their tapping hammers and scraping saws was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I watched a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16. She was struggling with her chisel. Her joint wasn't quite fitting. She sighed in frustration. But then she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and tried again. In her determination, I saw a spark of myself as a young man, a hunger to create, a desire to build something real and lasting with her own 2 hands. This, I thought to myself, is the real legacy. It wasn't the $2.44 million house. It wasn't the expensive furniture or the fancy parties. It was this passing of a skill. This chance for a young person to discover the dignity of hard work. The true inheritance wasn't money. It was purpose. I could feel Martha's presence in that room more strongly than I ever had in the big empty house on Willow Creek. She would have loved this. This was her story continuing. I don't know if Donovan will ever choose to walk the long path I laid out for him. I pray that he does, but my peace is no longer tied to his choices. I have done what I had to do. I have protected my wife's memory and transformed our life savings from a source of conflict into a wellspring of opportunity. My legacy is no longer in the hands of a son who did not value it. It is now in the hands of dozens of young people who are just starting to build their own. I didn't go inside or announce myself. They didn't need to know who I was. I just stood in the doorway for a while and listened to the music of creation, a quiet smile on my face. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the sounds of the workshop behind me. I had finally learned that a true legacy isn't what you leave in a will. It's what you build in the hearts of others. And in that noisy, dusty workshop full of promise, I was finally home. As I walked away from the community center, the sounds of the workshop faded behind me, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the park. I didn't feel a sense of triumph or victory. The ache of what I had lost with my son was still there, a quiet phantom limb that would likely never fully heal. People might call what I did revenge, but it was never about that. Revenge is a hot fire that consumes you from the inside out. What I felt that night at the party, and what I felt now, was a cold, clear necessity, a sad duty that had fallen to me. My actions were not for my own satisfaction. They were a final promise kept to my wife. I had promised to protect our story, and I had done so. The victory was not in seeing Donovan brought to his knees. The victory was in the sound of those hammers and saws in the workshop. The victory was knowing that the legacy Martha and I had built with our hands would now be passed into the hands of a new generation. It was a legacy of creation, not of consumption. I had to teach my son a lesson in the only language he seemed to understand anymore, the language of profit and loss. To learn the value of everything he had, to first experience the price of having nothing. I had to tear down the hollow structure of his life so that he might one day have a chance to build a real one on a solid foundation. Whether he ever chooses to pick up those tools and begin that work is a choice only he can make. I have to live with the fact that he may never forgive me, but I am at peace with my decision. A family, like a house, must be built on a solid foundation of respect and love. Ours had rotted from the inside. I had to tear our broken house down to its very foundation so that one day perhaps something true and strong could be built there again. And with that, I am at peace. This whole experience taught me a difficult but vital lesson. For years I believed a father's love meant giving endlessly, even when it was met with disrespect. I thought keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. But peace without respect is just a quiet surrender. True strength isn't found in a large house or a full bank account. It's found in the courage to defend your own worth and the legacy you've built with your hands and your heart. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to let their child face the true consequences of their choices. Have you ever had to make a painful decision to protect your own self-respect? I would truly love to read your story in the comments below.